Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to be here. Today I'm going to talk to you about rugged entrepreneurs, the geographic and cultural contours of new business formation. This paper is joint work with John Barrios at WashU and Daniel Macchiochi at Miami. I butcher his name every single time, and much of what you are going to see actually literally was run probably 2 days before this conference. So this is mostly brand new. Some of it's a little older, and you may have seen an earlier version of some of the initial stuff. But we're going to talk about today is thinking a little bit about what the drivers are of where we see entrepreneurial activity form in the U.S. And, obviously, I don't need to say anything to this audience about the importance of entrepreneurship for economic growth and why we care about these topics. But I think one of the things that we all know is that policymakers spend a lot of time thinking about interventions aimed at generating new entrepreneurial activity in their regions. And one way you can think about this is, this is a nurture, in the nature versus nurture kind of approach to things, is what can we do to get new businesses started. And this paper is actually going to step back from that and ask a completely different question. Is there a role for sort of nature? Is there something in the water in certain places, as we often say, that helps explain why we see certain patterns of entrepreneurial growth across the geography? And we're going to be talking here about the U.S., but we're going to be exploring the role of initial conditions. So in thinking about what the geographic distribution of new business formation is. And in particular, we're going to be thinking about culture that is the result of various historical factors from decades past. And what I'm going to try and convince you of is that some of these historical cultural factors from a long time ago are associated with or even lead to, in a causal sense, more entrepreneurial activity in current times. And in particular, I'm going to talk about 3 things. I'm going to talk about individualism and the culture of individualism. I'm going to talk about immigrant presence, and I'm going to talk about the mix of immigrants, diversity of where people come from and where they originate, what we're going to kind of call hybrid vigor in this paper, which is stealing from the hybrid corn in biology. But this notion that there may be an effect to having different people from different cultures come together. And what I'm going to try and convince you of is that we have these findings that are consistent with the notion that initial conditions and environments shape institutions, they shape norms, they shape beliefs, and that in turn shapes outcomes in the form of entrepreneurial activity. So we're going to document that these cultural primitives really shape entrepreneurial activity, and that's what we'll be talking about. We're going to be taking advantage of data that comes from Scott Stern and Jorge Guzman and many of the people who have been working with them. It's data from the Startup Cartography Project. Hopefully the slides will come back, but I can describe this to you. So this is data on new business registrations in the United States. It's kind of population-level data. And many of you have seen papers that Scott has presented here before and in other conferences. But it allows us to get effectively a geography of where new businesses are opening in the U.S. And we're going to be using quarterly level data at the county level in current times and tying that back to things that happened a long time ago in history. We're also going to be taking advantage of data on entrepreneurial quality, so the quality of the businesses that are started, effectively the predicted probability that firms in these cohorts of new companies are likely to have a high growth exit event at some point in time. So we'll show you not just quantity of starts, but also some things around quality. All right, let's see if we get our images back. Okay, fantastic. All right. Unsurprisingly, I think we all know this, that new business starts kind of cluster in various ways across the geography in the U.S. And one of the things that that sort of motivated us to look at some of these more historical factors in this paper is just the fact that if you try to explain the geographic distribution of where these new businesses form in the U.S., it turns out that 75% of the variation in the geography of this new business formation can be completely explained by simply county fix effects, time-invariant county-specific factors. And this was sort of an interesting sort of factoid for us that made us start thinking about what is it about these places potentially that could be driving this? And there's this extensive literature in sociology and cultural anthropology and now in economics as well that has hypotheses about why it is that cultural factors can influence economic activity or even entrepreneurship. So this long literature dates back to Weber, 1904, about the Protestant work ethic in the United States. There's a large economics literature now that shows that cultural factors have an effect on economic activity more broadly. And we're going to kind of take this to the entrepreneurship realm and think about these sorts of historical factors. In particular, we're going to be thinking about time that certain places in the U.S. spent on the western frontier as the United States expanded back from 1790 to 1890. We're going to be thinking about immigration and what share of the population was made up of immigrants back in the 1800s, and where those immigrants came from and what the mix of them looks like. And if you wonder why we think history might matter, well, we know a lot about the fact that sort of a distribution of cultural traits in the population at any given point in time ultimately can have a very large influence on its subsequent evolution. So new generations of people adopt beliefs about the behaviors of others. They adopt these traits and these cultural norms through intergenerational transmission. And ultimately, these sort of initial distribution of traits can affect these long-run cultural equilibria, and they can shape early institutions, and they can shape norms and preferences that then play out hundreds of years later. So that's the idea behind the paper. And as some historical background, it's useful to think about, kind of know a little bit more about what happened in the U.S. 100-plus years ago. So, the U.S. obviously started back in the late 1700s, but the population growth of the U.S. persisted all the way through the 19th century, and there was this massive, large westward migration from the initial colonies that were established in the U.S. And if you look at the 100 years from 1790 to 1890, which is effectively the period we'll be looking at, the population of the U.S. grew from about 4 million people to over 60 million people, and we kind of 10x'd the amount of land in the U.S. that was settled. And the movement of this frontier varied over time. So some areas spent very little time in frontier conditions. They immediately became very populated. Other areas stayed very unpopulated for longer periods of time. And that frontier effectively promoted a culture of individualism. So there's these nice papers in Econometrica and some other top econ journals by Sam Bazzi that kind of explores the effect of being on the frontier for a long time on individualistic culture. That these frontier locations attracted people who had specific sorts of characteristics. They required self-reliance, and that ultimately, as it turns out, decades later still shapes the culture that you see and the decisions people make in those areas in modern times. The other thing that happened at the same time as this is the reason there was all this growth is that there was this age of mass migration when lots and lots of people moved to the U.S. And pushed the frontier of the U.S. westward. And the age of mass migration, which went from 1850 to 1920, contained immigrants from a wide variety of backgrounds, whereas previously most of the immigrants had been from either Great Britain or Ireland or Germany. The immigrants that came in this period and pushed the frontier outward came from a lot of different cultures and a lot of different places and a lot of different religions. And all this immigration was facilitated by the railways, and there was a lot of settlement along railway lines, and we're going to take advantage of this in thinking about identification. So We're going to take this data on new business registrations today, and we're going to relate that data to these historical factors. In particular, we're going to think about the time spent on the frontier from 1790 to 1890, so decades on the frontier from Bazzi's work. We're going to look at some things around other indications of individualism and institutions that arise from individualism, such as the share of infrequent names back in the 1940s, kind of political leanings in today's times. We're going to look at immigration and railways. We're going to take all of this data from a nice paper by Sandy Sequeira and Nathan Nunn and some other co-authors, and combine data on railways and passenger lists of arriving vessels in the U.S. that were reported to the Secretary of State, and kind of get from this a bunch of things around immigration flows, the type of immigrants that we have, the mix of people in these counties, and the time that they spend on the frontier. So the first thing we look at in the paper is this notion of rugged individualism. So Bazzi's work in Econometrica shows that U.S. counties that spent more time in frontier conditions in today's day and age exhibit greater individualism. They have greater opposition to redistribution. They oppose regulation. They tend to vote Republican and things of this nature. And entrepreneurship in the public mind is often kind of associated with this notion of, I want to be my own boss. I want to be independent or individualistic or flexibility. And we see this in some of the work that Eric Hurst and Ben Pugsley have done in terms of why small business owners say that they've opened businesses. It's about non-pecuniary benefits for many of them. During this westward expansion of the United States in the early years, if you lived in a frontier county, you were better off if you demonstrated some independence and self-reliance, because there's not a lot of infrastructure for you to rely on. What Bazzi's paper shows is that you get this individualistic culture in these locations that persists even to modern times, and you see it even in how people reacted, for example, to COVID and the pandemic, and social distancing and other sorts of behaviors. So we're going to take these measures of total frontier experience from Bazzi, and just if you think to yourself, well, this is just about are you on the West Coast or are you on the East Coast? It's actually not. A lot of the places that spent the most time in frontier conditions are actually smack in the middle of the country, or in sort of varied locations throughout the North and the West. And we're going to take this and look at how this relates to, these sorts of frontier conditions drive individualism. How does this relate to new business starts today? Now, of course, you might think to yourself, well, the amount of time you spent on the frontier is probably something to do with your general economic development and other cultural and demographic factors in this area. So we're going to adopt the identification strategy from Bazzi and try and isolate some plausibly exogenous variation in this total frontier experience measure. And the way we do that is the way they do, which is to take historical shocks to settlement that were driven by immigrant inflows into the U.S. And these are going to be national population shocks that are time-varying but unrelated to the local conditions of frontier counties. So basically, there were a bunch of weather shocks in European countries at different points in time throughout these 100 years. Those weather shocks drove immigration into the U.S., and those outflows of immigrants from different countries ultimately drive the westward expansion of the U.S. And if you are a county that's right on the frontier, right about to be on the frontier, just as there's a massive immigration wave, you're less likely to spend a lot of time on the frontier. And that's going to be our approach to identifying the effects of total frontier exposure. And what we see in the data, and sorry, it's a little bit of an eye chart, but I will summarize for you, is that there's this positive relationship between having spent a lot of having been on the frontier for a long period of time, and ultimately what we see in terms of new business formation now in current times from, I think these numbers are from 2000 to 2016, but you can use sort of longer samples on this. And it also has a small effect on the mixture of the types of businesses that we see today in terms of entrepreneurial quality. It's a positive effect, I would argue that these effects are causal. It's about 1.25% increase in the entrepreneurial quality index from Stern and Guzman. It's about a 6% increase in the number of new businesses that are the number of new businesses per capita that are started in a county. That's a pretty significant effect. There are a bunch of controls in here, obviously, for various things, both demographic and geographic. We just to convince ourselves that, in fact, what we were seeing, give ourselves a little bit more support. In the paper, we also look at whether we see this in the financing channels and loans to small businesses. And this effect is there on a similar sort of order of magnitude for lending to small businesses, the number of SBA loans we see to newly registered companies in the SCP data. And this is thanks to Jorge and his former RA, Kang, who put this together for us. One of the things we wanted to think about is a little bit about the mechanisms around the kind of how the individualistic culture translates. And you can think about two things. There can be mechanisms around sort of formal institutions, and there are also sort of mechanisms that you can think about around informal transmission or transmission of informal norms and culture. So we look at two things here in the paper. First is thinking about formal institutions, and if anyone has, I hope maybe our discussion will have more ideas about how we can do more on this. But one of the things that you can think about in terms of formal institutions is we know that these sort of individualistic counties also tend to vote more Republican. They tend to be sort of more risk-taking and so forth. So what we do is look at the predicted Republican vote share that, based on frontier experience in today's day and age, and take a look at how that relates to new business formation. You do see this channel of the variation in sort of the Republican votes. So we think about these as policy-related. Republican, I guess, would argue they're more business-friendly. You see this channel materialize in the data for business starts per capita and for entrepreneurial quality. And if you want to think about informal channels, you can do a similar sort of thing. So one way to think about how you measure sort of informal cultural norms of individualism is to think about how people name their kids in later decades, whether they use sort of names that are less frequent in the population once you pull out, obviously, all of the sort of names that come from foreign origins. And we can do this same sort of thing. Bazi kind of shows that, even decades later, you see more unique names appear in these counties that were on the frontier for longer. And we'll do the same thing here to try and see whether that this is kind of consistent with some of this informal cultural transmission. Predict the infrequent name share in sort of the mid-1900s using the total frontier experience and see that predicted infrequent name share, that sort of indicator of individualism, is in fact also sort of positively related to the number of new business starts in modern times. So this starts to get us a little bit towards thinking about what mechanisms are. I think we have a lot more to do on this. But beyond frontier experience, we also want to look at two other historical cultural factors. So the first of these is going to be the immigrant share in the population in a county in 1890. And we know that variation in the historical immigrant makeup of U.S. counties has long-run effects on various types of economic prosperity measures and growth. And these are effects that could arise for many reasons: culture, genetics, networks. There's a lot of work that has spent some time thinking about these things. But we also know that if we look at sort of immigration and contemporaneous entrepreneurial activity, immigrants are more likely to start new businesses. There is a causal impact of contemporaneous immigration on innovation and economic dynamism in U.S. counties. And we kind of have the hypothesis that this sort of cultural trait of tendencies towards entrepreneurial activity that may be about the nature of the people who are willing to pick up and move to another country, could persist 100 years later into current-day local culture in the county and be part of the cultural norms that leads potentially to people starting more new businesses. Again, immigration is not exogenous, and there are a couple of things to think about. Immigrants, on the one hand, probably were attracted to places with economic opportunity and potential for long-term growth. You could see that playing out. Or there could be negative selection in the sense that immigrants may really have only had the opportunity to settle in more marginal areas where rents were cheaper and there wasn't that much potential for growth. And where we kind of take a look at this through the lens of this paper by Sakara, Nunn, and Kang, that exploits the fact that immigrants that arrived in the U.S. tended to use railways to travel to wherever they ultimately settled. And we can take maps of railways back in the early 1900s. Counties that were attached to railways got a lot more immigrants, and a lot more immigrants settled in those locations. The migration to the U.S. varied from decade to decade because of these weather shocks in Europe. And then we can attach this to the railways, and if a county was connected to a railway network during a period of high immigration flow to the U.S., it's more likely to have had a higher proportion of immigrants at the end of the 19th century. So we can take the interaction between these two, and this produces some variation that we think plausibly is unlikely to affect our contemporary outcome of interest, the new business starts, except through historical immigration to the county. So immigrant share actually looks a lot different than that frontier experience. So this is kind of just a general idea of what the pattern looks like, and you do get more immigrants in the north, in the northeast, and kind of wrapping around the west into the southwest. And what we do is we take the immigrant share in 1890 and relate it either in a base OLS or in an IV to new business formation. And once again, with here what we see is a positive relationship between the immigrant share back in 1890 and the new business formations per capita in counties today. So kind of even accounting for the selection that we can think of, and it does look like it's a negative selection effect here, what we see a significant increase in new business starts per capita in counties that had more immigrants back in the 1890s. And then the third thing that we look at in the paper is this notion that we sort of called hybrid vigor. I don't know if that term will stick once we're done writing the paper, but it's the diversity of where people came from in the county. So immigrants come from different origins. They're not necessarily uniform geographically or culturally. And these values spill over into the local population, and they persist over time. And you can imagine that having a broader diversity of backgrounds might lead to more diversity of viewpoints and thought. And this is sort of where we got this hybrid vigor kind of term for. This could be, in turn lead to more creative recombinations that support innovation and support entrepreneurial activity. On the other hand, you could imagine that it's possible that the diversity of immigrant origins leads to some sort of societal fragmentation, and that there's lack of social cohesion, and this somehow impedes new business formation. So what we do is measure a county's historical business birthplace diversity using data from the NHGIS, the National Historical Geographic Information System, from IPUMS, and take a Hirschman-Herfindahl index of the countries of birth for the entire population living in the county in 1890. And we're going to use this as our measure of diversity of country of origin. And it maps, although not perfectly, somewhat obviously to the immigrant share, which is what you would expect mechanically. And this I have no IV strategy for this yet, so this is absolutely a correlation. I don't think we can argue that it's necessarily causal, but we similarly see a strong association between having sort of a larger mix of backgrounds in a county back in the late 1800s, and what we see in terms of new business starts today. So I think I'm pretty close to running out of time, if I'm not mistaken. That's what I thought. Okay, so just the last thing that I'll show you, and I won't even wrap, is the last thing we do is take a look at joint effects and try and think a little bit about what the interaction between these variables are. Is there some sort of amplification? So if we know that immigrants are more entrepreneurial and that this entrepreneurial culture might be kind of passed down through generations in a cultural transmission, and then we know that frontier experience then drives, separately individualism in an individualistic culture, does that individualistic culture further boost, say, the persistent pre-existing entrepreneurial culture that was brought by having lots of immigrants in a county? So this is the kind of idea when we're thinking about joint effects. So, what can we see about what the effect of frontier experience is on new business starts as we change the share of immigration and vice versa. And this is what we see in terms of joint effects. There is an amplification. It seems like there's an amplification here, where individualism amplifies long-term cultural impact of immigrant entrepreneurial tendencies, and similarly amplifies the effect of diversity of origin. So I am out of time, but I think this is, again, brand new, but the goal was to hopefully start thinking a little bit more about cultural drivers of new business formation in the context of economics. And your comments and suggestions and thoughts, even though there was a lot packed in here, are hopefully you guys will have some good things for us. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. I think we have Kang from USC joining us online. Are you there?
Yep.
All right, so it's all yours.
Okay, thank you so much for having me, and my apologies for not being able to make it in person. I have one household member who is at a high risk, so I prefer not to travel a lot at this point of time. Okay, let me do the magic and jump into the discussion. As introduced, I'm Kang, Assistant Professor at Marshall School of Business. So this paper basically finds that time-invariant county-specific factors largely explain the formation of new businesses and their quality, why there's a cultural persistence. Exposure to frontier conditions, which leads to a culture of individualism, is the key driver. And I find this paper very interesting. It's really carefully written. If you actually read the full paper, and I learned a lot. But in the beginning, I was wondering, what's the frontier that this paper talking about? Because I was not familiar with this context. So I looked at the paper by Bazzi, and they show that in 1790, actually this is the area with population, and the red line is the frontier. And in 100 years, 1890, this frontier has expanded toward west, and it also includes these areas. So this paper is actually utilizing this expansion of the front borderline to study the impact of individualism on new business formation. And this is another version of the map showing the population density from 1790 to 1890. So this reminds of some interesting papers, the history papers that I liked, like Colonial Origins of Economic Development. And back in Berkeley time, my advisor Noam had a paper on medieval universities in 14th century actually had a long-lasting effect on economic activities in German cities. And I was really excited to see this historical analysis coming in the areas of entrepreneurship. Okay, one thing that I really liked about this study is there's a puzzle between county fixed effects explaining 75% of variation in new business registration, which is the number of new businesses, but only 16% of the variation in the entrepreneur quality index. And I think this is a very important contribution to the literature that is not highlighted enough in the paper. So if you think about the EQI, this is a very useful measure, but this is an aggregate quality at the county level. And I think we can actually separately estimate by the types of businesses, like self-employment versus mom and pop stores versus high growth entrepreneurs. And we can even look at the survival of these new formed businesses and their growth rates. And I think there are potential data sources, like not necessarily relying on the restrict use census data. We can actually use, for example, business dynamics statistics to look at the number of business entry and exit, job creation, their growth rate at the county level by business age or by business age and their initial size at the time of formation. And then another thing that I was wondering was what drives the observed patterns. This paper highlights the historical factors, but that historical factors could also affect the contemporary factors. This is probably the ideal one, but there could be some other factors. So I was wondering if we can directly measure the business level individualism, and I think some recent studies looked at the size of the headshot of the CEO on the financial report, or we can do some text analysis on the financial report, or even their social network service accounts. And in some sense, I think it's a matter of interpretation if we want to look at the direct effect or the snowball effect. So relatedly, if you look at the map of the total frontier experience, I see a bit of correlation with the existence of big cities. So can the effects have driven by the existence of large cities or the amenities that they offer? Or put differently, can we actually estimate the heterogeneous effects by these clusters? So what would be the effect for the Silicon Valley area versus Kansas City versus New Orleans? And in terms of the regression specification, actually, I'll just skip this part. But I was wondering what would be the economic magnitude of the effects, like what would be the 8% increase in the new business formation and the 4% increase in the EQI. How should we interpret these estimates? And in doing so, I think we probably want to drop the log transformation in the sense that the new business starts per capita is already a standardized method. So I think the distribution is close to normal, maybe not. So I was wondering if it would be easier to interpret the results without the log transformation. Another comment I have is about the first instrumental variable approach that used the immigration flows, because these immigrant inflow kind of made a pressure on the eastern bound movements, and they themselves moved towards west side of the continent. In the Bazzi paper, I think it is more well suited in the sense that these immigration flows may work through the frontier experience to the individualism. In this paper, we are looking at actually the business formation, and I think that a set of literature have established that immigrants have less capital in the United States and they don't have good network, so they are more likely to start their own business. So in that sense, this instrumental variable might affect the outcome of interest directly, raising some concerns about the IB approach in this first approach. And another point I would like to make is that I think the loan part is still being actively developed. So one suggestion that I have is that as authors explore these areas, I'm wondering if they can actually divide the demand channels and supply channels, like if there are more applications that leads to the more or larger loans, or if the financial institutions from the supply side have better equipment and ability to assess the quality of loan applications. And the last point I'd like to make here is the availability of interesting data. So here you can see the historical foreign bond population from 1850 to 2000. And there's an American Community Survey from 2000 to 2020. If you combine these two data sets, you can actually draw something like this. Immigrant population, say, from Asia for the last 5-6 decades. Or you can even draw a map like this, top metropolitan destinations for immigrants. So in the future, probably the reviewers ask you to consider the non-European immigrants and their compounding effects. And in that case, I think this might be an interesting data source. So to summarize, very interesting and novel approach to explore the historical origins of entrepreneurship. And the authors do a very, very careful job in the full paper. To highlight, I think the quantity versus quality will be really, really interesting. And I think it would also help if you provide some qualitative or anecdotal support that this individualism was really work behind the observed patterns. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Hill. So I think we can open up the floor for questions, comments, or Yael, do you want to have a comment to all the comments done? You're just going to take a question? Okay. All right. So, Scott?
Great. And, I've seen this paper before, but it is evolving, so there you go. I have a few comments. So one was a narrow but technical question. I was unsure why you, given that all your variation for most of the regressions are this kind of just what happened in 1890, I don't understand how you're using the time series variation from 1990 to 2016. It seems to me just more, I think for the main regressions you want them to be cross-sectional.
Yeah, so you can look at it.
And then obviously you take an average or something like that, yeah.
So you need a sum across the period. You could do it in a panel.
Yeah. There's a little bit where I think, this paper is maybe 4 papers or something like that, but sort of, right? The second, and I think the discussion was I'm agreeing with, is I feel like there was a little bit of lack of clarity on the one hand, you're using something that looks like an immigrant measure as an instrument, and then you're looking at a different measure of immigration as an explanation. And it seems like those, at least from my tiny brain, those seem a little hard to square. Do you see what I'm saying? I just feel like I actually like the idea of sort of instrumenting the frontier, what I'm saying, with a bunch of other things about, or kind of characterizing the frontier as some synthetic index or something from what was history like, and then looking at the average impact of history on the current day. I think that's a better way of thinking about it. And then I think the third part is more specific. It seemed to me, just looking at it, and when I've seen this before, that the coefficient on both the quantity and on the quality index, you have lots of significant results, but the size of the index vary by an order of magnitude across regressions. And every time I've seen either you or your co-authors present this, I feel like you're sort of maybe not emphasizing, this one is a big effect, and this one is, what I'm saying? I think they're just purely, I almost want a table that gives me, how many zeros are involved. Do you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So quantity, quality, here's the factor, and kind of overall sense. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. When you calculate the economic magnitudes, they don't vary nearly as much as the coefficients do, and part of that is the law and different things.
I almost want you to figure out how to. I almost think that what you might want to do is standardize everything, so that it's all on a common scale, so that then you could translate it in a way, because the STP statistics are very clearly, they are very interpretable. And so but once again, as you know, I'm a big fan of this.
Yeah, no, that's a great suggestion.
And Paul?
Okay, thank you. Nice presentation. In fact, I came up with a new mechanism or story that is the independence of women. Because women living in frontier, right? they have to be more independent. And at least, okay, let me share my experience from Taiwan. One of the reasons of Taiwan's entrepreneurship in Taiwan relative to other Asian countries, Taiwan women are more like liberalized, are more independent in general. So you can see a lot of female entrepreneurs. So maybe that logic can apply to those frontier areas. So, but since you know who registered for new business, maybe you can see the gender difference there.
Okay. Since you have the mic.
I stole the mic. So, do you know this paper by a guy's name? I think is Kyunyan Chao. Was at Cornell, a grad student. He just graduated. Anyway, he has a paper that's really, really similar to this, but different outcome variable. So the outcome variable he's looking at is basically how hierarchical firms are today as a function of Protestant ethic, immigration, diversity, all the same kinds of things you're talking about, and using historical data and everything. But one of the things that he has that's kind of cool that you might be able to make some use of is looking at coding state constitutions as the kind of indicator of the thing that you're sort of inferring in the middle, right? So you take the same inputs that you have, and then you argue that if there is a cultural difference, it will get instantiated and the way he does it is he's using that what was the conditions at the time the state was founded, which will happen in your period, right? And so you could code state constitutions at the time of founding by the degree of individualism versus collectivism, in the text, right? With the extent to which you figure out some way of coding that, but the political scientists have probably already done it, right? And there are these archives of state constitutions you can draw of something in Maryland, I think. So that might be one way to sort of get at this, but you also might just like his paper because he starts with the same thing. You go back to Weber and this kind of stuff. It's very, very analogous arguments, and both of them had this nice thing of the main argument is that the founding conditions back in the day continue to have contemporary effects. And he has another one on entrepreneurship, and I think things related to slavery, which is another one you might find interesting. But the one that I read that was close to this was the one on institutions and hierarchy.
Okay, we have another question back there.
I'm just wondering, what is the role of immigrants' ability to assimilate to the new country that they have migrated to? Because if they could assimilate more easily, then they would be able to actually get a job more easily and potentially less likely to take the risk of starting up new businesses. So I'm just wondering if you could somehow measure some form of immigrant assimilation just through their names. Maybe they adopt an American name or some sort.
Yeah, I think, so first of all, I think that both from the discussant and discussion, there are a lot of fantastic things. There are a lot of fantastic things that we could do if we had better data. So so I think that would be absolutely fascinating. We don't have immigrant names. We have sort of census counts of immigrants and where they came from. In the immigrant diversity measure, it does include not just the European countries that are the flows that kind of drove the westward expansion, but also sort of the Asian and other countries as well. But I think these are really interesting questions. In some ways, if all this does is provoke other people to dig for more data and do more work in this general area, I think that itself will be a really interesting push forward for understanding how and where we see this kind of activity. So I agree these things would be super fascinating. I don't know that we can necessarily do them. But.
So I have, okay, yes. All right. So I have a quick question. So let's say we understand the pattern what we see here based on historical, plausibly exogenous patterns. What policy implication would that have in today's world? Because if all of that is exogenous,
So this is an interesting question. These are sort of things, right? When we talk about interventions, when we think about assessing interventions and how they affect things, we know why, like, oh, can we do something along these lines? There's a little bit less when you say these are about culture. How can we really affect culture? But at the same time, there are many things that we try to do in various aspects, where we try to think about how we change culture. And if culture is a big piece of it, then we can start thinking about where does culture get changed? Maybe it gets changed in education. Maybe it gets changed in other things. But I think it is very different from, if we have this kind of program. I think the discrepancy between what we see with new business, like sort of how much of the variation is explained by new business starts versus entrepreneurial quality, is somewhat related to these things. That, like, the notion of individualism doesn't necessarily translate into I want to create a high growth business. It does translate into I want to be my own boss. I want to create something. But that could be just something that supports me and my family, and not necessarily something that's going to grow into a multi-billion-dollar company. So, in many ways, that was, to me, not necessarily a surprising finding, which may be why we didn't put very much emphasis on it to begin with. But it's harder to deal with these things. I think it suggests maybe with the lever that we push, maybe we want to spend more time pushing the lever on the entrepreneurial quality, which in any event we know is more tied to the economic growth in the small business, and maybe we want to acknowledge that certain patterns of small business creation are not necessarily things where we're going to get a lot of bang for our buck by kind of pushing up the intervention. So that might be one way to think about it. This is the first regressions with the TFE we ran. People who have seen this present, but a lot of the stuff in the paper is really like from the last 2 weeks. So we're still thinking through a lot of these issues, which is why all these comments are really helpful.
Great. And Jeff? And do we still have time? Before we over time? Yes, we do have time. Okay. All right. Excellent. I mean, this is fascinating. Thank you so much for presenting, and thanks for your discussion. So one of the questions I have is sort of a modestly conceptual question. Do we anticipate that there's something about the era in which we have the startup cartography data that leads that era to be particularly entrepreneurial based on the cultural seedings of the prior century? Or do we really expect sort of a cumulative process over the entire period from when the data have arrived? Like, it may be that there's just a fecund period of entrepreneurial activity that's seeded by all this stuff before. But I would be curious about it seems like if you've got this cumulative process, the differences would be really quite massive as they accumulate over time. But I don't quite know. And then one other question that I have is, one thing that I think would be neat to do is to look at those places where the 1890 conditions look great for entrepreneurship, but you then don't get it. Like, what is it that kills it in the places where it ought to grow? Is it, crazy policies, or they put a university there and that ruins it, or zoning? So I was looking that up. Actually, it seems like there's pretty terrible data on zoning regulations, though there seems to be some from the Urban Institute. But okay.
Yeah, no. On the latter, I think that's a really interesting thing to do. I think I don't know off the top of my head what I think about. I don't know off the top of my head what I think about whether there's something that amplifies it specifically in this point in time. But there is, this panel is 30 years, right? We can split up the periods and try and get a sense of whether there is some variation and potentially try and think about why there might be. So I think that's sort of an interesting way to think about it, is breaking it down potentially into sub-periods and seeing whether it's consistent over time.
All right. Do we have any more questions? I think, Yael, you responded to all the questions. Did you respond everything to what Phil said?
Yeah, I'll just say thank you so much for the comments and the thoughts, I think from everyone, and thank you so much for being willing to do this on a last-minute basis with very new results and new writing. But these are all great suggestions and great things for us to think about. So greatly appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Okay.
Thank you, and thanks as well from my side for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I present some joint work with my colleague Bettina Peters from ZEW, and the topic of this talk is misappropriation of R&D subsidies. We estimate treatment effects in a setting with one-sided non-compliance. So, as you all know, there's market failure rooted in spillovers and financial constraints, and therefore most countries around the world actually offer public funds to spur R&D in firms. And here is the main concern from a policy perspective is that these public funds may fully or partially crowd out private funds. However, this has been studied in great length in the literature, in the empirical evaluation literature. Now, however, there's a second threat to policy effectiveness, and that is rooted in the moral hazard behavior of grantees. And that comes to a point when grantees actually decide to misuse public R&D funds for non-research purposes. So far, the literature has completely neglected this is what we call non-compliance among grantees. And this is what we will work on in this paper here. So, obviously, misappropriation is much more likely under weak monitoring regimes. And we became motivated to work on that topic, and China, in the Chinese context in particular, by the following quote: only around 40% of China's research funds are actually used for research, whereas huge amounts trickle away. And that was a quote from the Chinese newspaper, China News Daily, in late 2011. And obviously, this shows that this issue of misappropriation was of major concern in the Chinese economy. However, that might not only be an issue in developing countries, but also in developed countries. For example, in the well-studied US SBIR program, applicants propose to use the grant for R&D, but there's actually no monitoring or enforcement once firms have received the lump sum, and they might use it for other purposes, right? So this also has a more general application beyond China. So the contribution of our paper is as follows. First, we develop a theoretical framework actually to measure misappropriation of R&D subsidies and also to study the impact of R&D subsidies with versus without misappropriation. And then we go forward to the more empirical part, and we estimate R&D policies' effectiveness given that there is misappropriation in practice in comparison to the efficacy in the counterfactual absence of misappropriation. In terms of data, we use all firms listed in the stock exchanges in Shanghai and Shenzhen for the time period 2001 to 2011. And these are large and medium-sized domestic enterprises comprising an unbalanced panel, including manufacturing, but also service sectors, excluding the financial industry. So that balance sheet data comes from Compustat, DataStream, but also Chinese sources as SISMA, Recit, Wind, and additional information is added from CNInfo. Further, we match patent data from the PatStat database. Our most important outcome variable, naturally, are R&D expenditures, and here we get the information from the annual reports of these firms provided by Wind, and this has been manually supplemented by information from CNInfo. Our treatment variable, obviously, are R&D subsidies, and here the total amount of subsidies is observable in the income account of Chinese firms. Before 2007, there was even a separate account for the subsidy income where the subsidies were classified according to different types and where you can then differentiate between R&D and non-R&D. After 2007, firms had to disclose in their notes all subsidies received at a almost booking reference level, and so you can really observe all of that transactions. And that's what we make use of after 2007. So we develop a semi-manual classification approach to classify all of that around 85,000 subsidy transactions into R&D versus non-R&D subsidies. And then, based on this, we go even more into detail. For the R&D subsidies, we differentiate between strict and broad R&D subsidies, where strict is only provided for R&D per se, but broad also includes support for patenting, tech acquisition, transformation, and rewards. Here it is important to say that in this paper and based on this data, we do not only observe R&D subsidies from a single program, but we really observe subsidies from all programs the firms is actually benefiting from. So this is not a single R&D program evaluation, but rather an R&D policy evaluation as such, right? Now, the sample coverage here is that we have around 16,000 observations for 2,300 firms. For these firms, we have non-missing R&D expenditures and subsidies, and that covers around 12% of the total R&D expenditures and 10% of the total R&D subsidies received by Chinese large and medium-sized firms. Now, people might ask, okay, you use listed firms, aren't there other micro-level databases with better coverage, for example? Yes, they are, but in these databases, you cannot observe R&D subsidies. In the best case, you only have total subsidies, and that would be insufficient for the approach that we're using here. So this is the best data available for the kind of exercising that we're doing. Now let me talk a little bit about the theoretical framework and how we actually measure misappropriation. So we start off with a basic model of optimal R&D expenditure by Howe-McFedridge, where the marginal rate of return is given by some function G1, which is defined or is comprised the level of R&D expenditure in this firm, the firm's innovation capacity, and some X1 vector comprising other firm and industry level attributes. And then the marginal cost is given by function G2, also depending on the level of R&D expenditures. Then returns to alternative investments, so non-R&D investments that the firm can do, internal financial resources, cost of external capital, and some other firm attributes comprised in X2. Now the profit maximizing level of R&D, R&D star, is then given by function G of that combined attributes, and here the profit maximizing level can actually be 0 or above 0. Now we extend that approach with introducing subsidy and the potential of non-compliance. And now what happens is if a firm receives a subsidy and decides to misuse it for non-R&D purposes, assume it will invest it into alternative investments, the RALT change to RALT prime, which is defined as RALT minus the expected sanctioning cost, where the sanctioning cost is occurring with a detection probability of P greater 0. So that is because this money is earmarked for R&D expenditures, and therefore if the firm is using R&D subsidies for non-R&D purposes, the opportunity cost and the marginal cost is actually lower in comparison to other money which is not earmarked for R&D purposes, for example, internal financial resources, right? So then the intersection of the marginal cost prime and the marginal revenue defines a new optimal level of R&D. And now given that there is a pecking order that it is rational for the firm, if it wants to invest into R&D, to use the subsidy, the R&D subsidy first, before other internal finance is used, we can identify and measure misappropriation M as misappropriation is given so that the subsidy has been received by the firm is defined as 0 in the case that the firm is actually expensing at least the amount of the subsidy received or more, and misappropriation is 1 if the R&D expenditures are actually less than the subsidy, right? So the difference between profit maximizing level of the subsidized firm and the subsidy also measures the absolute value of misappropriation. And now then the grantee's decision to misappropriate can also be defined here as this function H, which depends on the amount of the subsidy, internal finance, innovation capacity, alternative returns to investment, sanctioning cost, probability of detection, cost of external finance, and other attributes. Now, once we take our measure to the data, we get the following first figure here, where you can see that around 42% of grantees actually misused R&D subsidies, amounting to a substantial 53% of total R&D subsidies cashed out to these firms, which comes quite close to the 60% presented in the newspapers. And what we can also see is that there's a substantial decline in misappropriation along the extensive margin of misappropriation after 2006, which goes in line with the introduction of a seminal new innovation policy in China, the so-called mid to long-term science and technology development plan, which substantially increased the sanctioning cost for firms. Right? But what we also see is for firms that actually misappropriate, the intensive margin stays at almost full or zero misappropriation here, and that might be explained by indivisibilities of R&D investments. Now, this is a measure which is new, and therefore it's quite important to validate it, obviously, right? And one source of noise or measurement error might be related to R&D subsidies as such. So we are testing here for changes in the timing or compositional issues related to the receipt of R&D subsidies, and we're coming up with 4 different measures as such, where we say, okay, in the original measure, subsidies are received and expensed in the same year, and that's actually according to the Chinese law. But now we assume they are received in 1 year and expensed over a 3-year time period. We only account for the strict R&D subsidies and not the broad R&D subsidies. We say there's only misappropriation if over all years in which we can observe a firm, the expenditures are lower than the received R&D subsidies. And we also go ahead and take some anecdotal evidence seriously, which says that there are certain government officials which keep up to 50% by themselves, so they only cash out the other 50 to the firm. So we adjust for that, but still the pattern remains largely the same. And we will use these later on in the robustness test as alternative outcomes. So then we address the issue of measurement error coming from unreported R&D expenditures. Obviously, if the firm is not reporting R&D, but it's receiving an R&D subsidy, that might inflate our misappropriation measure. So we want to be also careful here. First, accounting regulations and R&D tax allowances make it rather unlikely that firms are not reporting R&D in the first place, because it would not be to their benefit. But then we also want to do an empirical investigation here. And what we do is that we regress the count of patents on the R&D stock. So we estimate that zero-inflated negative binomial patent production functions here. And what we can show is, yes, the R&D stock has a meaningful explanatory power in these models for all observations and also only for grantees. And now if one would assume that misappropriation is actually not measuring misappropriation, but is picking up unreported R&D, we should see also some significance here for the log level or the instance of misappropriation, but that's not what we can see. And the Bayesian information criteria also is supportive of the more restricted model here. So that gives us some support that we are actually measuring misappropriation and not unreported R&D. Now finally, we go forward and do some firm-level regressions to confirm the theoretical predictions that misappropriation is not some random phenomena, but it really depends on that internal and external attributes that I just discussed. And this is what is actually confirmed here. So after controlling for selection into the treatment based on some Hack-Prop model, they're estimating the likelihood of misappropriation. And we can see that it depends on the amount of the subsidy, which is actually a nonlinear relationship. And then it also depends on the R&D experience and the profitability of firms in a way that you might expect. Then we have these other variables which approximate the likelihood of detection. And here the introduction of that new policy and also the appearance of mutual fund investors in the firm have a significant negative relationship on the likelihood of misappropriation. However, the potential for corruption and actual corruption in the business environment of the firm has a positive relationship. We take that as support that misappropriation is actually measuring what we want to measure and is affected by this firm level and other attributes in the way that was predicted in our theoretical framework. So then we go ahead and do the actual treatment analysis. And here we have a setting where we investigate treatment effects with one-sided noncompliance. This is because treated firms receive the R&D subsidy from the government, but they can decide to be compliant or not. But non-treated firms are not treated, and they cannot get treatment from other places in China. It's not like in the European Union, where a country can get sources from the EU. In China, you're either in or out. So we have a setting here with one-sided potential non-compliance. And therefore, we distinguish between the assigned treatment Z and then the actual treatment D, in the case that the firm is actually using the treatment as intended by the government. So the assigned treatment Z is then estimated as the intention to treat. And here, for consistent ITT estimation, we need to randomize the treatment because, as in many or almost all R&D settings, this is not randomly allocated to their selection. And we do this based on entropy balancing, which works quite well in our case. So you can see that before balancing, there are huge differences between the treatment and control group. After balancing, there are almost no differences, and that's not only the case in the mean, but also for the variance and the skewness of this two distribution. And another way to check that this balancing works pretty well to eliminate observable differences is to estimate these likelihood models here, linear probability and probit, for the non-balanced and the balanced sample, where after balancing in the probit model we have virtually zero explanatory power left by the observed attributes. So we will also control for time invariant unobserved confounders, and then people might say, yes, but what about the time variant unobserved confounders? And we also do some tests on that later on, so I'll come back to that. Right? So we go ahead and estimate the following function here, where we have a log growth rate over a 2-year time period in the R&D expenditures, and then that is regressed on these other attributes. Most important here is this gamma ITT parameter of the treatment indicator Z, and this gamma ITT will tell us the average ITT effect of R&D subsidies on R&D growth. We also control for firm-specific variables and other industry year, industry year fixed effects in this regression. Now, the second thing is that we want to estimate the effect for the actual treatment D, and here the effect that we're going to estimate is the complier average causal effect Casey. We can use exactly the same model, but now there's another problem for causal inference because there's additional selection bias. So treated firms can now decide, based on the expectation of the treatment outcome, whether to use or not the Z as a D, and therefore D is confounded with a potential outcome, and we need to address for that. Now, the good thing is that we can use, for identification, we can use Z as a valid instrument for D, and that is actually the case if Z is randomized, and that is achieved by entropy balancing in the first stage here. Then Z only affects the potential outcome through D, which is known as the exclusion restriction, and that is reasonable in our setting. And then also monotonicity is given by design in our setting as we have notifiers. So it is a very suitable setting then to apply this IV approach and estimate the Casey. So a couple of words on the content-wise comparison of the ITT and the Casey. The ITT really measures its effectiveness, or estimates the effectiveness. So how effective is the R&D policy in a setting with misappropriation? And the Casey tells us about the efficacy, so how effective would have been in the counterfactual setting without misappropriation. Now, policy-wise, both effects and their comparison is relevant. So if the ITT is 0, but the Casey is significantly positive, then the design of the R&D policy is sufficient in the first place, but better implementation is actually required, right? However, if both the ITT and the Casey are 0, then the R&D policy is ineffective even in the situation of ideal implementation. And for policymakers, it obviously matters a great deal if they should adjust the policy design or the implementation of that overall scheme. Finally, the relation of effectiveness to efficacy then informs us about the loss in effectiveness due to non-compliance. Let's have a look at the main results here. I would like to focus on column 2 and 4 for the ITT and Casey. You can see in terms of the estimate parameter, the gamma ITT has a size of 0.877, and the Casey parameter is more than 2 times higher. So what does it mean in terms of crowding out and additionality? So we can test and we can reject that there's more than 25% crowding out in the ITT, but we cannot reject that there's less than that. So it means in the ITT we have a setting where there is a partial crowding out, actually, given that there is misappropriation. For the KC, we can reject any crowding out, so we can see that there's an additionality effect. So due to misappropriation, the potential additionality effect really changes to a partial crowding out effect, which is quite a meaningful change. And we can see that in terms of the Kleinberg and PARP F statistics, that this IV strategy is actually very strong. Now a little bit on treatment heterogeneity. So we can see that both the effectiveness and the efficacy significantly improve after the introduction of that MLP policy change in China. And we can also see that too high subsidies result in full crowding out. We also find, with regard to high and low tech, that R&D subsidies fail to increase R&D in high-tech firms. It might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but in the Chinese setting, there are many firms defined as high-tech which are operating in value chains, which are actually not very much in the need of financial resources to conduct their own R&D, and therefore much wasteful R&D subsidies is then allocated to these firms, not really generating additionality effects. In terms of ownership, this is more intuitive. There's full crowding out for state-owned firms, whereas private firms are responding much better to that policy in terms of R&D subsidies. In terms of other outcomes, we find that there's output additionality, but no behavioral additionality. So we find an impact on the employment, fixed assets, sales, and patents. We don't find an impact on the productivity in these firms. And we also don't find any evidence that firms are actually changing the behavior, how they're doing R&D, so there's no impact on their high-tech or IT orientation, university-industry collaboration, or the employment of foreign inventors. What we also find is that in the long run, the estimates both for the ITT and KC increase, but importantly also the gap between these estimates. So there's even more loss in the long run. The KC then is more than 3 times higher than the ITT. And finally, from a welfare perspective, it matters how this misappropriated money is actually used. So if it's not used for R&D, what do firms use it for? It could be invested. It could also be expropriated for consumption as such. And what we can see here is that this misappropriated money actually has effects on net fixed assets investment, on sales, also on labor productivity in the short run. And in the long run, we see most of these effects actually maintained, which means that at least a part of the investment is, of the misappropriated money is actually used for investment into physical assets. Not all of that is extracted purely for consumption. Right? So in terms of robustness tests, we do really a bunch of robustness tests. So we address measurement issues by using our alternative measures that are introduced before. We address omitted variable bias by including potential time-variant confounders and doing the sensitivity test proposed by Oster. So a test by Oster tells us that our unobserved confounders would have to be more than 2 to 63 times more important than the observed confounders to turn the estimated effect to 0, and the benchmark proposed by Oster is 1, so we are well above that benchmark. Thank you. Which shows that these unobserved confounders might not be a very substantial issue in our setting. We control for various sources of substitution bias, and we address placebo, common trends, and as far as possible also test the exclusion restriction. So let me conclude. We extend the model of R&D expenditures to analyze the influence of misappropriation with R&D spending. What I've not shown you is that it shows that there's a U-shaped relation between R&D subsidy size and the likelihood of misappropriation. In our model, misappropriation always lowers the impact of R&D subsidies. We take that to the data and we show that non-compliance exists around 42% of grantees, amounting to the 53% of all R&D subsidies received in these firms. And once we go for the causal investigation, we show that misappropriation really reduces the impact of China's R&D subsidies by half from a potential additionality effect that the policy could have to realize partial crowding out effect. Thank you very much.
So next we have Yael Hochberg.
Thank you. All right, so as you've probably figured out by now, there is a lot in this paper. And this is perhaps unsurprising. This paper has been presented in many places. It has gotten a lot of comments from a lot of very, very smart people. I'm not 100% certain that I will fully contribute to its improvement because it already has quite a bit in it. But I'm going to do my best to offer up some thoughts to the authors. I took a flyer on the fact that Philipp would present very well and explain it very well, and I'm glad to see that is how it worked out. So this paper is a paper about the effect of R&D subsidies. And, this is obviously a very important thing for us to be looking at. Most countries offer subsidies of some sort, and, these subsidies are meant to try and address concerns that, we may face suboptimal levels of R&D at firms because of financial constraints or other market failures. Obviously, firms can misuse these subsidies in various ways, and the goal of this paper is to try and think about how can we identify misappropriation, and how can we explore the consequences for effectiveness of policies. The author did a great job of explaining the sort of difference between picking up intent to treat, which is what most of the literature to date has tried to do. But obviously, if firms are misappropriating, that's not going to give us a great assessment of whether the design of these programs is well done. There is a lot to like about this paper. So first of all, I think this is sort of one of the first looks at a very important and unresolved question around is there misappropriation of subsidies? If so, who does it? And what determines when it happens, and what implications does this have for our estimates of the effects of R&D subsidies? Is this crowding out? Is it additionality? What does it mean for design of programs? It's an extremely impressive data set, and I think you could tell from just the description of how much is in there, and the authors have done a very careful job of explaining what they've done in the paper, and they have done a ton of robustness work. A lot of it is buried in the back. I'll get to that in a bit. But the paper's clearly gotten a lot of feedback, and we really just want to commend the authors on what they've accomplished here. Okay, so the major focus here of the paper, not so much of the presentation, but certainly of the way the paper is framed up front, is that there is lots of misappropriation, and the literature measures this intent to treat effect, and that isn't quite the right way to measure everything that we need as a policymaker. So let's go and use this methodology that we often use in randomized experiments, kind of pull the effect for the compliers, this complier average causal effect, and differentiate that from the intent to treat, as the way you termed it, sort of efficacy versus effect. So, the goal here is to figure out, are these subsidies actually additive? I think that the paper kind of loses the ability to make even more of a contribution by really putting the frame on just this measurement of the measurement of the treatment effect. right? You frame it that way in the title and so forth. But I think there's a lot to learn here from what you've done, just simply about who and under what circumstances misappropriation is likely. And this is the stuff that tends to get buried in the back of the paper and your appendix and so forth. It's lost in the current framing. But I think this is an area where, it's like the directionality, the existence of effects is interesting in and of itself, even if we can't fully pin down magnitudes. And there's a lot more that you could be exploring here, including how the funds are misused using the data that you have, that I think would make for a real contribution. The other thing that sort of jumped out to me that I think the paper didn't put as much emphasis on is that misappropriation seems to be predictable off observables. And the implications for this are that we can identify ex ante which groups are most likely to misappropriate. And that means that we can think about precisely these questions around the implementation of programs. Does this mean that perhaps we should consider withholding subsidies to these groups? Does this mean that we could design targeted monitoring programs that are less costly than simply saying we need to monitor more or we need a one-size-fits-all policy? And I think you could dig into this aspect more, both in terms of the writing and in terms of what you can say with the data. So now I want to get to the piece that you do put focus on in the paper, which is this issue of the intent to treat versus the complier average causal effect. So this consideration here that I think is worth thinking about. You've thought about it a lot, you've tried to do a lot, but I still think is worth thinking about some more. So who receives a subsidy is not random by definition, right? Who applies is not random, who is awarded is not random, and for the approach that you're taking, this randomization is a key. So you try to address this with the entropy adjustment, but this entropy adjustment is really only going to deal with observables. Right? So the observables in this case only explain about 21% of the selection into intent to treat. So there's another 79%, and obviously there's measurement, et cetera, out there. There are other things that are probably a factor that are not in the set of observables. And importantly, a lot of these other things are unlikely to be related in any way, or certainly not in a consistent way, to the observables that you have. And that creates a problem for the attempts that have been made in the paper to try and address this question. So what the authors do is go to this paper by Emily Oster from 2019 and try to do a test for whether unobservables are sort of confounding things here. But that test was designed around a very important key assumption, which is that the relationship between the treatment and the unobservables can be recovered from the relationship between the treatment and the observables, which is to say situations where we think we simply have poor or incomplete proxies for the things we want to control for. So the classic example, for example, that Emily used in the paper is, we're regressing wages on education and ability, and there's two components to ability, and we think our proxy picks up one component but not the other. But we think that both components of ability should be affecting wages in the same fashion. And I think here the issue is that you haven't yet convinced me as a reader that that is the situation we have here. I worry a lot that the selection for applying and the selection for receiving actually are a function of things that are unrelated to the observable controls. And this is where I think it would be worth spending more time, because I don't think the Oster test takes care of it. And this doesn't mean there's no use in the exercise. It simply means it's worth thinking and then telling something to the reader about how do we interpret these estimates if we think that the treatment is not random? What does it actually mean for directionality? What does it mean for magnitudes? What kind of takeaways? Where should we be thinking about the caveats, and what does this mean for both design and implementation? And I think this is maybe another reason that putting full focus just on the approach with the one-sided compliance might not be the best way to make a massive contribution. Then there are some other thoughts. So one of the things I was wondering about is you have various alternate measures of misappropriation in the paper. And in one of them, you do something that I thought was quite appropriate. You say subsidies can be multi-year. We're going to sum over 3 years, and we're going to ignore the inconsistencies within those years and look at the inconsistency across the entire period. I think this clearly matters, but and more importantly, it reduces the lower bound on misappropriation by about half. And it shows a much, much starker pattern of reduction around the MLP. And I think this is worth thinking about in terms of whether this is maybe a more appropriate measure to be using in your main effect. The only other thing I'll say before I'm out of time is one of the things that's clear from the graphs is that we don't just have compliance or noncompliance. We have partial compliance, particularly after the MLP. And when you have partial compliance in these situations, you have to think a little bit more carefully about what those estimates are. And I think that's another place that you could potentially push forward. But just in general, really, really exciting work on a really big, important topic. You didn't leave me a whole lot to comment on, which is great. And I'm really excited to see what comes next, especially with the richness of the data and the implications that this can really have for design of programs. So, thanks.
Okay, so let's open up the floor for any questions or comments. John?
I thought my comment made sense until the last comment you just made, and then I think maybe I misunderstood something. So you had that graph where you showed, this much of the thing we estimate is misappropriated, but then you show basically either you're misappropriating or you're not, right? And then you said, well, no, it's not binary, it's continuous, and it's in after, so now I'm confused. But let's pretend that it is binary, because that's how I read the chart. And if that's true, does your model about misappropriation and the things that, the maximizing I'm doing and everything, does it predict it's going to be binary? Wouldn't it predict it's going to be basically continuous between 0 and 1? And then is it surprising that it seems like if you're going to misappropriate all of it, or is it by construction that the way you're using it's a difference, it's going to end up that way? I'm just curious about that.
Okay, so I thought this was fascinating. This is definitely a paper that will go in our doctoral course for going forward. That's very interesting. Also, a super important topic, one that is very not studied and clearly very important. So I have 3 very brief comments, and I think as Yael said, my sense is this paper is basically done. I'm not sure how far it is in the refereeing process, but presumably I would encourage you to do more on this. So 3 really quick comments. The first is I couldn't figure out, and I'd love if you could maybe explain once again, how you're using the fact that there was a new policy in the estimator. Was that super important to the shift from the ITT to, no. It seems to me that's the experiment. And then instead, you're more doing basically selection on observables, but you have this great experiment with all of a sudden there's, manipulation, there's direct manipulation, and presumably many of it's the same firms. And so you could sort of see, change in behavior ex post being extremely valuable, because you could then infer that those are the guys who are, misappropriating ex ante. That's one. Second, in this conference, but also more generally, Josh Lerner and some co-authors, I'm trying to remember her name, either way, have this great measure of, that's in, I think it should be in your data, of how there's a higher level of the unobservable that Yael was talking about, the bribing and whatever, in Chinese data, which is it's all in the after 2007 or whatever. There's some moment where the amount that you put into how much you spend on hotels and travel reduces by 90%. That means you're, going to the hotel gift shop, buying Rolex watches, and that whole thing, right? Okay. So it goes. So that's part 2. I just think you could use some of the, maybe you already do that, but use the literature on sort of the audit, sort of this kind of auditing approach on Chinese sort of corruption. And then the third part, which I thought was, and this maybe also goes to Yael's point, but does go to a more careful calibration exercise. So what you have is, even when I misappropriate, it's not like I'm going off on vacation, right? So I'm not going, off to some great, you know what I'm saying, which is usually what people think. But it's just that there's a budget, I use it, to build out my plant or pay my employees or keep the shop open or whatever it is, or maybe do marketing, run Facebook, I guess, ads or whatever it would be. And so then the question becomes, well, if it's good for the firm's growth anyway, what the hell do you care if it's R&D? Except for one thing, and this is, I think, a point that Adam Jaffe made it's made by many people, but Adam made it in a way that finally it sunk for me and led, in some sense, to the very nice paper by Myers and Lanahan that's coming out in AER, looking at the DOE SBIR program, which is the reason we give out subsidies for R&D are the spillovers. And presumably there's no spillovers from I ran a marketing campaign. Do you see what I'm saying? And then I think from other literature you could calibrate, and so I think what you could assume is that the misappropriation, I'm not even sure misappropriation is the right term because it's still been used for a legitimate purpose, but it's being used for a non-spillovers purpose. Do you see what I'm saying? But the other thing you can calculate, once again, drawing even from a literature, is for the economy, that's a waste of money because you're not getting the dynamic benefit on other firms. Do you see what I'm saying? And so I would think that number, which is how does misappropriation influence the subsequent growth trajectory, implicitly, relative to what's the firm growth trajectory, would be, I think, would sort of sharpen almost in a kind of Hendren-Finkelstein sense, kind of the marginal value of public funds. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So I know those were detailed, but wrapping up.
Now, thank you for this very insightful comments. I think you really nailed down the pros and cons of these papers quite accurately. So I would like to thank you very much for really reading through this and also going through the appendix and our solid work. And I think you are absolutely right with focusing on this issue of unobservable confounders, right, which might not fully be addressed by this Oster test, and I think it links a little bit with Mr. Scott's comment to really address for more and other sources of variation that might explain both, treatment and outcomes. And here I appreciate that comment on the paper by Josh Lerner, and I think it's really fun, and some courses, right, where they use these ETC expenditures. We have that in the data. I think we also used it. Maybe we could really use it more explicitly also in the Oster test, just to show, if you have it then or not, and it's most arguably not very much related with other variation we have, and how far that matters, right? So really some like on-spot checks, introducing some otherwise, not captured variation. I think it's a very good point. I'd like to thank you for that. In terms of the multi-time subsidies, yes, there are multi-time subsidies, but we cut the data in a way that we have a very clean setting that every subsidy that is received by the firm starts from a non-treatment to a treatment status. So it always goes from 0 to 1 to have a very clear change in the treatment indicator. And then we allow for treatment in multiple consecutive periods or not. I think we did some heterogeneity tests in how far that affects things, and that's also one of the reasons why we allow for this change in the outcome over a 2-year time period to give that treatment a little bit more time to unfold, actually. We do a little bit about that, but you're right, one could do more here, and that is something we have not fully exploited, so we certainly also take that as an important note. Personally, yes, I'm also most convinced of our measure C, how I call it, this most, conservative measure of misappropriation. The only problem here is you exclude potential, you exclude type 1 and type 2 at the same time in a way, right? So you really make sure that you have this, false positives all out, but you also potentially throw out firms which are actually misappropriating. So, yeah, it comes at a certain cost, but I think you're absolutely right. More emphasis again, even more on this confounder issue. And then I think the packaging of the paper, yeah, it's an important point. I mean, we wrote that up from a very econ perspective. In this audience, I heard more about storytelling and positioning of papers actually, and probably there's a bit to learn from that, how to package a paper and maybe tell a more coherent and more comprehensive story and not just focus on the overall measurement thing. So thank you again for that. Great comments. On the binary misappropriation, that's actually, you're actually right. So the variation is along the extensive margin. The intensive margin firms really rather misappropriate or not. So it's like above 95% of that is on average misappropriated. We do a little bit with these investment thresholds, where you say, only up to a certain threshold you can actually invest in the first project. Only if you reach the next threshold you can actually invest in the second one. And then whether by definition or not, if a firm has not enough R&D money available to reach the next or the first threshold, it will not invest at all, which by definition then is related to full misappropriation. And that might be the case because some firms actually also don't receive all of the amounts they've been applying for because the government is holding back some of that, right? And but you are right on the measurement thing. We also address that by really throwing out in one robustness test everything which is not clearly binary, and the results hold. Then Scott, yeah, thanks. Great comments. Yes, you're right. So we are not exploiting this MLP experiment. We are just showing that it matters for the changes in the misappropriation behavior, but we are not using it at all for identification. I think that's something which now the literature is paying more attention to, also that more China-specific econ literature, and I'm pretty sure that's something we could work on and where we could make use of. Finally, on that misappropriated money, you're absolutely right. I mean, the firm might make a rational choice, but then considering the loss in welfare, it's not the best from the policymaker's point of view.
Just even to go further, right? Because one thing I was confused on. Suppose I start the project, and it turns out it doesn't work. I think I have some great R&D project, doesn't work. So I shut it down. I still have the money. I throw it into my marketing campaign or my physical plant or whatever. I think we would view that as a very good use of funds from a private perspective. It's probably not illegal in some, you know what I'm saying? No one's going to give the money back.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so, I know in the SBIR program in the U.S., they're actually quite careful in tracking that the money is not being used outside of innovation. And so, even there's this huge debate that you're not allowed to use it even to file patents, right? I mean, Yael, right? Is that right? I think that's correct. You know what I'm saying? Right? It's actually that you have to apply for some other grant to get a business plan. Even if you use it to, you can't even use the money to hire a consultant to help you with a business plan. You know what I'm saying? And so, where this seems like they were in an era where you see what I'm saying, right?
No, absolutely. And I mean, I'm well aware of Kyle's paper. I was in the same session with him in Druid last year, and he also presented in our department. And yes, I think that might be a way we can follow up with. Not sure if we really can press that into this paper, but maybe follow up work where we really focus more on this, welfare versus private returns. Absolutely makes sense. So. Thanks again, everybody. This is really great food for thought, and I'm happily forwarding that to Bettina. So thanks again.